very generous with that. I appreciate that. So we'll give it a few minutes and we'll start. But my aim is mainly from this session to introduce myself, the role, hopefully that you'll walk away feeling a little bit more confident about the process of accessing reasonable accommodations, what they are if you're entirely new to this process, the support we offer in the disability service, and even if you leave the session still having questions, which hopefully you will have a lot of questions, you'll know what questions you even need to ask and want to ask as well. So that's the aim for the session. But in the interest of it being everyone's lunch, we might kick off. And if people join, it'll be okay. So I'm going to start my stopwatch to keep one eye on everywhere and the stopwatch as well. So if anyone online, by the way, just, you know, if the volume drops or anything like that, you can pop a message in and it should pop up for me here and I should be able to see it. So just let me know. But thank you guys so much for being here in person, online. It's such a nice day. So I really do appreciate the sacrifice on your lunch. My name is Jen O'Connor, and I've been working in the disability service for a few years now. And I'm newly into this role as the Staff Disability Liaison Officer just the last 2 to 3 months, which is really exciting. So hopefully I'm going to give you guys a bit of an overview on that. But before we get started into that, I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping. I think I have to manually hit it. Yeah, there we go. So we are recording this session just in the interest of a few people who said they couldn't be here. That's part of the reason in which I've disabled the chat for anyone online. Just in the interest of GDPR, protecting everyone's data, if you have questions, there is a Q&A enabled. I should be the only one able to see that. I'm just conscious that someone might share personal information, you know, might be a personal circumstance. That's your own information, that's private. So we'll just keep that to the Q&A, if that's okay. I have also, as a result, had to stop anyone online using their camera, but you should be able to use your mic. So if there's time for questions at the end and you do want to ask a question, you should be able to use your mic and that should be fine. And I'm hopefully going to leave time for questions at the end, but we'll see how we go. You will have a follow-up kind of information. I will reach out with information after this, resources and all of that. But you can also book in with me and we can have a further chat if needed. I'm also, fair warning, going to warn you, there's some slides with a good bit of text on the screen. That's not because I'm going to be reading it verbatim. It's more so for the merit of sharing the slides with you after, so you have the information, but also anyone who couldn't be here. So if you see a lot of text, just don't immediately panic or dissociate. I totally understand, but it's just there for follow-up information more than anything. But I always prefer to give a pre-warning on that. So the aim of the session overall is going to be introducing me and my role, my responsibilities, looking at, I suppose, broadly our definitions of disability across campus, how we can hopefully broaden that and look at our experiences in a different angle maybe. Reasonable accommodations, what are they? How do we access them? Who defines reasonableness? All of these different areas. Also the needs assessment process. Your information, because you might, you know, if you have a disability and you're thinking, I could really do with support, I have this medical information, I need to share, who sees it? Where does it go? That's all very fair, I think, to question and to worry about. So we'll hopefully address that all very upfront. And then I'll hopefully end by giving you a little bit of information on how to reach out to me after. And also hopefully get used to coming into the disability service as a space. If you haven't been in this room before, if you're here in person, this is our community space. This is where our students use a lot of different groups, things like that. So we try to be quite a community oriented space, and it'd be nice for that to become a space as well where staff can connect. So moving on, just to introduce myself. So as I said, I was here already in the disability service, which I think does help because I think maybe we're all aware Trinity has its own quirks and ways of working that takes a while to learn as a system. So it's really, really handy to already be able to kind of hit the ground running, a little bit at least, and know a bit about it. I did very much focus on supporting third years, fourth year students transitioning into employment. It's very different to get supports in a lecture versus the workplace. They don't always translate across all of those kind of areas. So that was always my area of interest. So it's kind of a natural progression. I'm also doing a PhD in social policy here in Trinity, so I'm very interested in disability narratives, how we talk about our disabilities, how we talk about our experiences as well, and how others do. I'm very interested in the campus conversation around inclusivity, which I think is definitely moving in the right direction, but maybe we can do more about that. And also, I have personal experience of receiving and benefiting from reasonable accommodations. I benefit from them now. I'm autistic, I have ADHD, I also have a chronic illness that pretty much probably takes up, there's no decision I make that doesn't include that at all times. But being able to bring that into the workplace and say, hey, here's what I'm dealing with, has changed my professional trajectory, I think, in ways that I can't really even fathom. So my aim is to be able to support other people in that as well. So that's just a brief background on me. In terms of my role and the responsibilities, generally, obviously, I suppose the overarching aim is to support disabled staff in Trinity. But how we do that isn't just from interacting with disabled staff members themselves, conducting needs assessments, making sure, that any recommendations from those needs assessments are put in place. It's actually also about attitudinal changes across campus, engaging with estates and facilities, for example, HR, academic registry, all of these different areas around how we can make the environment less filled with barriers so that by the time someone comes to disclose, maybe they're already aware and able to advocate for themselves, because Trinity has that reputation of being an inclusive workplace. Obviously, all of this takes time, but that's the priority. I do also support staff members who have episodic conditions. So, I don't think anyone's disability experience is particularly static. Everything's impacted on a day-to-day basis. Even when I was walking in this morning, I was thinking about the heat today and how that's going to impact so many people's conditions, and so many people's ability to show up to work and everything like that. So there's sometimes a need to review ongoing support, see what's going on there, see if the situation has changed and what we need to do. One of my key priorities at the moment is resource development for staff, line managers, and HR specifically. As you might know, if you are someone who has a health condition, you could have had a temporary injury a while ago, all of these kind of conditions that maybe meant you're out of work for a while. You've maybe had to go to occupational health. You've had to talk to absence management. All of these systems in Trinity and in workplace in general are very overlapping and almost latticed together. We need to embed inclusivity into each section of that. But part of that is also just our education for line managers. How do we have these conversations? For staff themselves, how do I approach my line manager? How do I identify in the first place if this is a safe place to disclose? And then, of course, looking at our recruitment practices. If you've been at any of the staff induction sessions, or I think even the provost staff updates and things that are really good, there's a graphic that's there of the moments that matter of Trinity, and it's essentially the different stages of life of a Trinity employee, from recruitment all the way to retiring, leaving, moving on, whatever it might be. My aim is that there's somewhere in each of those, the conversation about disability needs to be prioritized at each stage, not just at recruitment, which obviously we can do a lot more around making recruitment accessible, but also around progression, managing probation, for example, identifying your ambitions. What can I do? Actually, I think this place might be somewhere I can grow because I can trust that these people can hear what I need and listen and take it on board and adapt. All of those stages matter all the way through. So that's essentially the role in a very all-encompassing way. Naturally, we do also have our statutory aims as a public sector body here, which is to get to 6% of staff members being disabled by 2030. I think we all know probably that if we were to account for every single person who's living with a disability, a health condition, who's neurodivergent, anything like that, it's certainly more than 6%, no doubt. But a lot of us, I think we do certainly kind of almost stuff it down and keep going, move on, keep going, keep it together. Certainly that has been my mantra in the past. In getting to that number of 6%, yes, we want more people to disclose, but that needs attitudinal change, systemic change, and how we make Trinity a place where that is naturally, by default, a psychologically safe decision. So that's certainly a lot to be getting on with, I think, in the early stages of the role. But just to give you a bit of background, we're obviously going to be focusing in this session very much on supports for you yourself if you're disabled, or also if you you might have a colleague, for example, who you know has a condition or something, and you think, actually, I heard this once, maybe you could redirect them here, all of those kind of things. So, okay, so I think before we do anything else, we certainly need to look at our disability definitions. I think it's probably fair to say that most people would have, I suppose, maybe a more narrow view and definition of disability. Certainly, if disability doesn't cross your mind on a regular basis, I find that quite hard to imagine because of our work here in the disability service is so embedded within that. But definitely, I think if it's something that maybe you're not thinking about that much, it can be fair enough that your definition maybe is a little bit limited. But what we're looking at in terms of our definitions here for supporting disabled staff is we're going to be looking at the Employment Equality Acts. Where they come in and where they define disability is kind of interesting, I think. They do talk about disability as being a difference in any kind of physical, mental health, intellectual, sensory differences. They do have categories like that, but the Employment Equality Act really focuses on functional impacts. You might be someone who's on the journey to a diagnosis. You might know you're autistic, for example. You might be being diagnosed with endometriosis right now. You're pretty sure that's it, but God, the process is going to take a long time. Any of those kind of conditions, what matters to us is going to be the functional impact. How are you showing up in the workplace? What's impacting your ability to show up in the workplace? That's where the Employment Equality Act certainly differs a little bit from the Disability Act of 2005. What I find interesting, though, about the Disability Act 2005 is the wording around substantial restriction. I find that interesting, and I'll hopefully come back to it a bit at the end, because everything to do with employment law around reasonable accommodations has to be, and you'll get sick of this word by the end of this, interactive, which means we have to have a conversation with me, with you, potentially with your line manager, maybe with the service that you work in general. We need to look at how your condition, your experience interacts with the operational needs of where you work, all of these things, which means that the decision about what's a substantial restriction or substantial just difference is an interactive conversation around it. So when you're thinking about disability in terms of, you might be thinking to yourself, do I even qualify? Somebody else might need the support more than me. Whatever you might be thinking, I've had all of those very strong kind of narratives in my own head. What you need to do is look at whether you have an experience right now that is having a functional impact in the workplace, that is making your workplace and your work less effective. It's not comfortable. I think if we could potentially look at Trinity becoming a place where our day-to-day jobs are not the source of suffering, but are actually the source of refuge, because we know we'll seek support, then we're moving in the right direction. Even if your condition is not diagnosed, if you are going through medical investigation, anything like that, we can work with you and see what can be done. We can at least have the conversation around it. So don't be afraid to speak out in the first place. Okay. This is one of the ones with lots of text that I was warning you about. So essentially, where we look at reasonable accommodations, I think this definition is important to put up, and people did ask for the slides to be sent on after and to put in the definitions and things, so I put them in fully. But what matters here in terms of reasonable accommodations, we might have ideas around reasonable accommodations. For example, if you're a wheelchair user with physical access concerns, a reasonable accommodation might be being your teaching takes place in an accessible building. You're assigned to that office. A ramp is put in place, something like that. But it can be a lot broader than that. What employment equality law looks at, and the Equality Act generally looks at, is could this person be fully competent to do their job if they had supports? It's not from the before of no supports. That includes from the point of recruitment. That's why, I don't know if you guys will remember interviewing for Trinity, there will have been an option to disclose a disability. I think it was just a tick box, if I remember right. But even then, if you did tick yes, which I did, I'm pretty sure I did, the recruitment team reached out to me after and said, do you have any accommodations for the interview? Because the idea is that you're viewed as being fully competent and capable to take part in the interview if your needs are taken into account. This is very important to look at from every stage of the employment process, including also probation. Your probation and everything should be reviewed with reasonable accommodations considered. Of course, for that to happen, we have to have a conversation, but we'll get to that down the line. But that's an important pre-starting point, I think, around reasonable accommodations, is to know that, are you capable and competent with them in place? They're defined in the Equality Act as any access need allowing someone to participate in, advance in employment, training, for example. A lot of us don't think about our CPD needing to maybe be adapted. We could be dyslexic, we might need, might have a visual impairment, might need the information to be magnified, whatever it might be. The only instance in which a reasonable accommodation might not be able to be put in place or might be deemed as not being reasonable is if it puts a disproportionate burden to the employer. Where that means here, and it's not included in the definition, it's included further down in the directive, I think, is the disproportionate burden really refers to disproportionate financial burden, but also if there's a disproportionate burden to the operational needs of where you work. So for example, if your job is, you're front facing, you're on the desk, you're a receptionist, for example, but then your reasonable accommodation is that you cannot use the phone, that challenges the operational needs of the service. Do you understand what I mean there? So once again, if that's something you were struggling with, I would still say come in and we'll have a conversation. What we might need to look at actually, we have to prioritize along with your needs, the operational needs of the service always have to come into it. That's where further down in the directive, it talks about it needing interactive as a conversation. So examples of reasonable accommodations. Reasonable accommodations, I think, can be a little bit creative depending on the workplace and depending on where people work, but these are just some examples of assistive technology. For example, like that, you might be dyslexic, you might have trouble with taking the minutes of meetings, for example, might be really hard to do, keep up with. Occupational therapy, think about our tenure track academics who are so stressed trying to do everything. They might need help looking at what their occupational balance is. What are their triggers if they're maybe neurodivergent and they have sensory needs? All of those things. Ergonomic furniture, you could have a spinal injury, temporary or otherwise, doesn't matter. Communication adaptations, this is one that's coming in a bit more and more, I think, particularly as we have more neurodivergent in general, but also autistic staff members disclosing, is saying, I get these directions verbally from my manager about what to do, but I could so do with them being written down as well. I could so do with, following on to that meeting, here's bullet points of what I said for you to do. Something like that. And honestly, these make massive differences. Training modifications like that, sometimes it's as simple as captioning, having an ISL interpreter, whatever might be needed. And adaptations to work schedules. For example, we have some staff members whose teaching needs to take place at the start of the week versus the end of the week because they might have dialysis, they could have chemo, they could have any health appointment, for example, but they can't get that accommodation if we haven't been able to make anyone aware of it. And remote working options. Again, remote working options are really dependent on the operational needs of a service, but it's a conversation that can be had because a lot of places, and depending on where you guys work, you might have some remote days, but it might be actually, I do better in the office. I need to come in, but I need a private space to be in, or I need a place with a more dimmed lighting, or I need my remote working day to align with my manager's also remote. Whatever it might be, those conversations are incredibly nuanced and dependent on the condition. So once again, these aren't all encompassing. And if you don't see yourself reflected in them, I wouldn't necessarily panic on that. I would say have a conversation and we'll see what can be done with your needs. What are the needs of the service or the area you work in? And what can we communicate? So this is where the knowledge of the employer is pretty important. In terms of the Employment Equality Acts, it doesn't actually reference anywhere and say that you have to inform the employer or disclose. However, case law that is based on them and based on the Employment Equality Acts does state that there is an onus on the individual to tell the employer if they want a reasonable accommodation, that it cannot be assumed that the employer is meant to have inferred something, that they're meant to have assumed there was a disability, actually that it has to be an honest conversation from the employer themselves. I think this does generally come from the point of view of trying to encourage the autonomy of the disabled staff member themselves. What's your narrative? How do you talk about your disability? It doesn't matter if your disability is very visible and you think, oh, my manager obviously knows. I use a, I use a walking cane. I use something that, he knows there's something there. Very different to sit down and say, hey, my arthritis is this. Here's how it impacts this. He can do a lot more with that information then. So it's important for us to assume that the employer, or to not assume that the employer has information or has inferred information or has heard information. It has to come from you. Otherwise, the employer cannot act reasonably. That's where the importance of dialogue comes in. And the use of the word interactive process is used over and over as a conversation in there. You might, for example, have a really good working relationship with your manager or with the team in general, and therefore they might anecdotally know, oh guys, I'm actually getting assessed for ADHD. It's really impacting my work right now. But that's still not the same as saying, hey, can I sit down with you and talk about my patterns of work and how that impacts me? It still has to be a different conversation. And if you are unsure of your relationship with your manager, you don't know how to talk about it, or you just want to trial that conversation, that's where you can meet with me first. We can sit down and just have a conversation and say, you know what, let's tease it out together. Where are your concerns around disclosure? What do you think the benefits would be around disclosure, which I think a lot of people don't talk about. We talk a lot about the risks around disclosure. Will I be penalised? Will my progression be impacted? Are they going to view me differently? These are certainly all things, our anxiety is our worst enemy. It will do that to you. But there are certain benefits to disclosure as well, and being openly yourself and able to live as yourself. But you might just want to talk that through first, and that's where we can support you here in the Disability Service. So gathering evidence, this is something that comes up repeatedly, I suppose, is that individuals are saying like that, I have medical evidence of, I have a spinal issue. There's lots of evidence from my pain specialist, from a consultant. How much do I share? Who gets to see this? Do I have to share this information? I think this becomes particularly sensitive when we have individuals who have mental health conditions, for example, and they might think, I don't know if I want to share that full report with the disability service. Who's going to see it? Something like that. It is part of the Labour Court's view, and personally, I do think it makes sense logically within employment law to gather medical evidence, to put that together in the interactive process. So the idea is that on the table, we have your narrative of what you're telling us, what's your lived experience. The manager, maybe at a later stage, we talk to them and they say, well, here's what the service needs. Here's what's coming up down the line that they don't know about, actually. And then we also have, here's what's on paper as described as a difference, a difficulty, a challenge, particular to the workplace. And that all informs the conversation that we have, so that everyone's perspective is heard in this, with the priority of supporting you as the individual in a way that, once again, removes and doesn't put any disproportionate burden on the operations or the finances of an organisation. So it is reasonable for medical evidence to be requested, and also more medical evidence to be requested. If maybe it's not very clear on a letter what the condition is, or just the functional impacts might be a little bit different. Okay, so I'm going to talk through a little bit the needs assessment process and what you can expect if you do reach out for support or reach out to talk to me, and talk you through this, just so that you have an idea of what to expect, I guess, in the various stages. I think for me anyway, the big thing is the unknown in all of this. So what you might do, and what I have seen a little bit since coming into the role, is people saying, do you mind if I meet with you just first before I do anything, just to have a quick conversation to say, hey, I'm a bit nervous about sharing this. I don't know how to talk about it. It's a new diagnosis for me. I'm processing it emotionally, but I could do with support. What would that look like? I'm happy to meet with you at that stage and to have that conversation. Just know that we won't be able to put in any reasonable accommodations in place at that point until we have a further conversation. But if you would just like to tease out disclosure, if you'd like to tease out, I suppose, what that might look like for you, that's absolutely fine. Now, you might also talk to your line manager. A lot of people will say to their line manager, hey, I'm really struggling to recover from that surgery. It's really impacting, my ability to stand for a long time or walk long distances, whatever it might be. And they will hopefully, as we get resources out there, get more comfortable with redirecting you here and directing you to speak to me and to speak to us in general. When I reach out to you, and if you reach out to me initially and you ask some questions and say, hey, I don't know what the process is, and you say you'd like a needs assessment, what I'll invite you to do is to share some medical evidence. This will be in a confidential SharePoint folder. We might be changing our process as we go. Hopefully this whole process will continue to adapt and become more robust and stronger as more people register. There is also a consent to disclose form. This form allows me, if needed, to speak with, for example, like that, if you needed an accessible parking space, I need to talk to Estates and Facilities about that on your behalf, or to talk to HR, for example, and say, hey, this individual, it's really needing remote work. How do we go about that? Because in the team, that might pose difficulties. Are there alternatives? All of these kind of conversations that need to happen. The consent to disclose form is quite detailed. You're advised to think about that, take some time to look at it, and then sign it if you're feeling comfortable. I also ask you for a copy of your job spec. This is hard when people have been in the roles for a long time, and generally it maybe isn't super reflective of their roles right now, but either way, it's still really good to get an overview of what someone's original tasks were, or if they've evolved. It helps our conversation when we meet. If the evidence is uploaded and everything like that, you'll be sent a booking link. It'll be my booking link, so you can pick a time that suits you. All of our work schedules are a little bit all over the place. It might suit you to meet online. If you prefer in person, that's also fine. And then we decide to meet. In our meeting, what we'll do is we'll look at, once again, those functional impacts. I'll ask you to talk me through maybe what is that condition like for you, and what's that condition like for you on a daily basis in your job. Okay, take me through an average day. What does that look like? How do you manage that condition? Is there medication you have to take? Do you have medical appointments you need to go to regularly? All of these different kind of considerations. There's two options here. A lot of people, for example, don't actually need reasonable accommodations that their line manager needs to be informed about. They might be separate, and for example, it could be occupational therapy done internally through the DS. In that case, it might be written down as internal supports only, and therefore your line manager doesn't need to know that you're having that support. But if it is an adaptation to the working environment, for example, a work schedule, something like that, something that's going to impact the operations of a service, we do generally need to speak to the line manager and the service in general about that and say, hey, here's what we're proposing. This individual presented with this. How would that impact the service? What do we not know from your perspective? And they might say, actually, that mightn't work, but this really would. Something that I won't have considered, because like that, I'm not going to know absolutely every service in Trinity. Throughout that collaborative conversation, we come up with a reasonable accommodation recommendation report that's initially reviewed by yourself as the employee to see, does that reflect what you need? Does that reflect what we spoke about as well? I also typically send people a summary of our conversation, just because I want people to be able to say, actually, that's not how I want that reflected. That isn't actually what I meant by X, Y, or Z, things like that. And then once a staff member approves it, we will ask for a line manager to formally sign off on it. We do put down review dates generally on these, so that, for example, they might change at any point. The needs of a service change, definitely within the disability service, for example, the academic year versus summer, totally different, but the needs change and we need to review it. That being said, I might put down a review date depending. I'll discuss that with you. Could be, in a month's time, 2 months' time. But if you want to meet sooner, that's absolutely fine as well. So that's generally an overview of the process. There might be small variations in there versus, where we might have to have more robust conversations with line managers, hopefully with yourself as well, and making it a collaborative conversation and seeing what we need to do. But that's an overview of the process. So I don't know. I'll go back there. Skip that slightly, sorry. So I suppose just to finish up, it's just to talk about your data and your information. I will say this to you at the start of a needs assessment when I meet you, and maybe if you work in a student service, it's kind of similar, is our conversation is going to be confidential, unless, of course, I do feel as though you're maybe presenting as a risk to yourself or to somebody else. The natural bounds of confidentiality do also apply here in this case. In terms of your medical information will be shared and stored in your confidential SharePoint folder on SharePoint. That's accessible by myself, and it's not accessible by HR or by other services. It is separate within that. And what do you do if you don't have medical evidence? On our website, if you look up Trinity Staff with Disability, and if you might have evidence, for example, showing that you have gone to neurology appointments, there's a sample form there that you can take and ask your neurologist to complete, where it asks questions about the functional impact in the workplace specifically, and you can look at that too. So that's just a bit of an overview around your information, around your data, but once again, I'll probably talk this through more with you when we meet one-on-one if you have any kind of specific concerns. So I'll finish up there, but that's our email, which is the Staff Disability Support at tct.ie. If anyone has any questions, you can email that as well. But I will stop sharing, I think, for now.